Hello, class, and welcome to Sound Bites Week 3 on the births, plural, of rock and roll. We have a lot of material to get to this week, as always, so let's go ahead and dive in. I want to start with a quote by Sun Records producer Sam Phillips. Do be warned, there's a use of an archaic term for a black person here, the sort of older form of the N-word, but it is the text of the original quote. So here we go. Sam Phillips says, "If I could find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, I could make $1 million." So why do I share this quote, despite the sort of political incorrectness of it? Well, the reason is because it really encapsulates some of the dynamics, the social dynamics at play in the origins of rock and roll in the 1950s. We looked last week at how there are numerous influences, numerous streams that fed into the origins of rock and roll, and this week we'll see how those come together, but the way in which they come together is deeply influenced by the segregated South. And so this idea here that Sam Phillips said, if I could find a white person who could produce the sound, this sought-after sound that was in black musical communities and traditions at the time, then that's something that he could profit off of. So food for thought, keep that in mind. Sort of the central takeaway question this week is the question of who invented rock and roll. Was it Elvis Presley? Was it someone else? Was it Chuck Berry or Little Richard? And ultimately, does this question matter? Now, the reason why this is important is because many people, and many of you on your first Flipgrid assignment, mentioned that you associate rock and roll with originating with Elvis Presley. And this is a commonly held belief within our society. However, I think as we'll see, that picture is greatly complicated. And so I like to just frame the discussion with this question. We're going to frame our discussion with an introduction and then something by way of conclusion. But in the middle of those three, we're going to look at three early rock and roll artists in the 1950s. One is Elvis Presley, then Little Richard, and finally Chuck Berry. Now, to properly contextualize this week's material, we need to talk about the term rock and roll. And to talk about this term, we need to talk about Alan Moondog Freed, who was DJ at the Cleveland radio station WJW. Now, Alan Freed had his own radio hour, and in this show, he mostly played rhythm and blues music. However, when he did, he didn't usually call it rhythm and blues music because, as we learned last week, rhythm and blues was a term that was used as a replacement for race music, so it would be implicitly understood that this was the music of black artists. So instead, Freed rebranded this music of rhythm and blues using the term rock and roll to be more palatable to white audiences. Since he's sort of creating a new name for this, it can sound like it's a fresh genre or a fresh phenomenon. Now, within rhythm and blues music, rock and roll had become a slang term for sex. So he sort of appropriated this lyrical term and made it a term for the music as a whole. Now, Alan Freed may have popularized this term in radio usage, but it started to get picked up by many DJs across the country. Ultimately, what rock and roll was in its origination by this term with Alan Freed is black music that has been packaged and rebranded to be listened to by white audiences. However, at this point, there were still not yet white artists that were making what could be called rock and roll music, and so that's going to set us up for Sam Phillips and Elvis Presley in just a bit. Here's a good quote from Alan Freed explaining how he thought of rock and roll. He said, "Rock and roll is really swing with a modern name. It began on the levees and plantations, took in folk songs, and features blues and rhythm." Of course, there, that last part about blues and rhythm referring to rhythm and blues or black musical traditions. So right there you can see on the surface the social dynamics of the term rock and roll. It was taking black musical traditions and making it hip, making it acceptable within a particularly southern white society to listen to. Now, it became incredibly popular among the youth, and so Alan Freed sort of became known as a voice, or a spokesperson for the young generation. His dances, such as the Moondog Coronation Ball, could be called the first rock concert, where he brought together a number of different rhythm and blues artists and bands, and just the young people would come out and attend these in force. The Moondog Coronation Ball in particular had 20,000 attendees within a 10,000 person space, and the overflow was so extreme that ultimately the police had to come and break up the dance. And So in the future, they tried to space out the dance so that they wouldn't overflow capacity. Now, as for Alan Freed, in the late 1950s into 1960, there was what is known as the payola scandal. So payola means paying for a person's record to be played. One of the most common record players is Victrola, and so you combine those two and it's payola. So big DJs such as Alan Freed, who was working in a New York radio station by this time, would take money, basically bribes, or what they called consultation fees, in order to play and promote certain artists' music or certain record labels' music on the air. Of course, this meant that those artists or record labels could then make in much more money, but it was determined in a congressional hearing that this is unethical and violated the regulations of the industry. And so because Freed, one of rock and roll's biggest proponents, and others were fired with the negative associations of the payola scandal, the popularity of rock and roll actually declined coming out of the 1950s, combined with a number of unfortunate events that took a number of prominent rock and roll artists out of commission.